All right, today we're diving into a story that feels way more like a modern sci-fi epic than an ancient scripture. We're talking about the incredible and controversial Book of Enoch.
So let's just start with a big question. What if that whole story about the first sin, the one with the apple in the garden, is completely wrong?
What if the real original sin was something way bigger, way more cosmic? A story about a rebellion in the heavens, where divine angels, totally consumed by lust, came down to earth and spawned a race of flesh-eating giants that almost wiped us out. Yeah, that's the story from the Book of Enoch.
So, where did this wild story even come from? We're talking about a book that was, believe it or not, a huge deal in early Jewish and Christian circles. I mean, it's even quoted in the New Testament. But then, poof, it was basically scrubbed from history. And when I say scrubbed, I mean they really, really tried to make it disappear. The whole story of fallen angels and their monster kids was just so radical, so challenging to the official narrative that the powers that be branded it heresy. Church fathers denounced it, rabbis literally put a curse on anyone who dared to read it. It was banned, it was burned, and for more than 1,000 years, the world thought it was gone for good. And then, just like something out of a movie, everything changed. In the 20th century, archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and guess what they found among them? Multiple ancient copies of the Book of Enoch. This was huge. It was proof this wasn't some medieval fan fiction, but a real, authentic ancient text that someone had tried very, very hard to bury. So you gotta be asking yourself, what was in this book that made it so dangerous? Well, the whole saga kicks off not on Earth, but way up in the heavens, with a group of angels known as the Watchers. And they made a pact that was going to mess everything up. The book says it straight up. There were 200 of them, and, led by a guy named Simjaza, they all swore a binding oath to each other. They were going to abandon their heavenly posts, go rogue, and descend to the world of mortals. And why? What was their grand cosmic motivation? Lust. Simple as that. They sought human women, the daughters of men, and were completely overwhelmed by desire. Now, this wasn't just, breaking a small rule. This was a total betrayal of their divine purpose, and it was about to unleash absolute chaos. The fallout from this wasn't just some divine slap on the wrist. No, the consequences of what they did gave birth to a literal nightmare on Earth. Because when these divine beings and mortal women had children, well, the results were unnatural, to say the least. The book says they gave birth to great giants. We're talking about the Nephilim. And these were not just tall people, they were something else entirely. Just how big were they? The text says 3,000 ells. Now, an ell is an ancient unit of measurement, and while scholars debate the exact conversion, we are not talking about basketball players here. We are talking about creatures of truly impossible, mythological proportions. But it gets so much worse. The fallen Watchers didn't just create physical monsters, they corrupted humanity's soul. They started spilling all these forbidden secrets from heaven, teaching humanity how to make weapons, the secrets of sorcery, astrology, and even vanity, like cosmetics and jewelry. They basically handed us the playbook for war, magic, and godlessness. And this new race of giants? They were a walking, talking disaster. Their appetites were as massive as their bodies. They ate everything, all the crops, all the animals. And when that ran out, they started eating people. And when that wasn't enough, they turned on each other in a massive, cannibalistic free-for-all. So, you can imagine the whole planet is basically screaming out in agony under this wave of violence. Heaven needs to intervene. And the man they choose for the job is Enoch, a righteous scribe who, as the Bible famously puts it, walked with God. Now here's the twist. Because of their sin, the Watchers are totally cut off from heaven. They can't pray, they can't ask for forgiveness, so they actually go to Enoch and beg him to plead their case for them. But it completely backfires. Instead, God gives Enoch the job of delivering their final, merciless judgment. Talk about being the bearer of bad news. To prepare him, Enoch is taken on this incredible guided tour of the cosmos. And seriously, the descriptions of his journey are some of the most mind-bending, otherworldly passages you will ever read in ancient literature. He travels to the very ends of the earth and sees the raw machinery of creation. He sees not just the building blocks of the universe, but also these terrifying empty voids. Places with nothing. No sky, no ground, no water, no life. Just pure chaos. He calls it a waste and horrible place. Can you even imagine seeing that? And then he sees this, 7 stars, bound together, burning like mountains of fire. An angel explains to him, hey, those aren't just stars. Those are other heavenly beings who transgress God's command. It's a vision, a sneak peek of the exact same fiery prison that is waiting for the Watchers. Okay, so the Watchers are punished, the giants are wiped out. Story over, right? Not even close. According to the Book of Enoch, their destruction actually created a brand new permanent plague on the earth. And this might be the book's most startling legacy. It gives us a direct origin story for demons. In this telling, demons aren't fallen angels. No, they're the malignant, disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. Because they were hybrids of spirit and flesh, their souls couldn't move on. They're bound to the earth, forever hungry, malicious, and causing trouble for mankind. And this wasn't just some one-off idea. You see this concept of powerful spirits born from giants pop up in other ancient texts too. The Book of Giants, also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells a very similar story. And then you have later legends, like the Testament of Solomon, where the king is literally enslaving these same spirits to build his famous temple. So this idea had legs. From here, the source material we're looking at takes a really interesting turn. It pivots away from the ancient mythology and tries to connect this story to what it presents as real-world physical evidence. The source makes several bold claims. It says that the island of Crete was once called the Land of the Giants. It claims ancient historians wrote about this history. And get this, it alleges that enormous skeletons, some over 30 feet tall, have actually been unearthed only to be documented and then quickly sold off to private collectors, disappearing from public view. And that's where this ancient, epic text leaves us, with a story of fallen angels, a race of monstrous giants, and a specific origin for the demons that haunt our world. It really makes you wonder, if a story this huge could be written out of history for 1,000 years, what else is out there, just waiting to be rediscovered? Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are going way, way back to the oldest epic story we've ever found, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And what's amazing is, this story survived for over 4,000 years, written not on paper, but on clay tablets. Just listen to that line, pulled straight from the epic itself. It tells you everything you need to know about this guy. We're talking about a king so powerful, so legendary, that his story has literally echoed through millennia. He's one of those figures where the line between a real person and a myth gets very, very blurry. I mean, you have to wrap your head around this. Before Homer wrote the Odyssey, before the Bible was written, there was Gilgamesh. And what's absolutely wild is that for thousands of years, this story was completely gone, vanished. The cuneiform script it was written in was a dead language, and the tablets themselves were buried under the sands of what's now Iraq. It was only rediscovered by pure chance in the 19th century. So let's dive in. Where does a story like this even begin? Well, here's the kicker. It doesn't just start with a myth. It starts with a real person, a king who historians are pretty sure actually walked the earth. Yep, most scholars are on board with this. Gilgamesh was a real king who ruled the city of Uruk almost 5,000 years ago. And his actions, his deeds must have been so monumental that over time, the man became a legend, the legend became a myth, and eventually he was seen as a god. Okay, so that line between myth and reality is already pretty thin, right? Well, get this. In 2003, it got even thinner when a team of archaeologists thought they might have actually found his tomb. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? That a 4,000-year-old poem could lead to a modern archaeological find? It sounds like something out of a movie. But the epic itself gave them a huge clue, describing the king's tomb in a really specific and pretty strange location. So guided by this ancient text, a German-led team headed out into the Iraqi desert. They didn't have a treasure map, but you could argue they had something better, the world's oldest epic poem and some very advanced technology. They used magnetic imaging, which is basically a way to see what's underground without ever having to dig. And what they found was just astounding. The outline of what could be the tomb, along with gardens, canals, buildings, an entire complex they called a Venice in the desert, just like the epic said would be there. And this potential discovery is so incredible because it physically connects us to the world of this story, a story about a king who is described as larger than life, literally two-thirds God and one-third man. Now, the story itself really kicks off with this incredible dynamic. You've got King Gilgamesh, who's part god, sure, but he's also a complete tyrant. His people are suffering, so they cry out to the gods for help. And the gods answer by creating Enkidu, a wild man from nature, to be Gilgamesh's equal and put him in his place. And what follows is this powerful, transformative journey. They start as enemies, have this epic fight, but then they become the best of friends, inseparable. They go on these huge adventures, slaying monsters like Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, but in doing so, they defy the gods, and the punishment is severe. Enkidu is sentenced to death. This loss completely shatters Gilgamesh, and it launches him on this desperate, world-spanning quest to find the secret to eternal life. So on this quest, Gilgamesh meets a wise old man named Utnapishtim. And this isn't just any old man. He's the only human to have ever survived a world-destroying flood and been granted immortality. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh this terrifying story. The gods were angry with humanity and decided to just wipe the slate clean with a cataclysmic flood. But one god, Ea, secretly warned Utnapishtim, telling him to tear down his house, build a massive boat, and save the seed of all kinds of living things. The storm raged for 6 days and nights until everyone else on Earth had turned back to clay. Now, if that story sounds a little familiar, well, you're not alone. The parallels with the story of Noah's Ark are absolutely shocking. When this was first translated in 1872, it caused an uproar. A divine warning, a hero building a giant boat, filling it with animals, sending out birds to find land. It's all there. And the key thing is, this story predates the writing of Genesis by more than 1,000 years. It was a massive revelation. You know, this story of how we even have this epic to read is a pretty amazing journey all on its own. It was lost, and then it was found. I mean, just look at this timeline. It all starts with a real king, almost 5,000 years ago. Over centuries, poems about his deeds emerge, then they're compiled into this masterpiece version, and then silence. Cuneiform writing dies out, and the story of Gilgamesh just vanishes for almost 2,000 years until its dramatic rediscovery. So these clay tablets were actually dug up in the 1850s in the ruins of a great ancient library. But they were just thousands of broken fragments. It wasn't until 1872 that a self-taught scholar named George Smith at the British Museum was piecing them together and translated Tablet XI, the flood story. You can imagine the excitement. It was front-page news, sparking this huge controversy and completely reshaping how we understood the ancient world. So after 4,000 years, why does this ancient Mesopotamian epic still feel so powerful? What is it about this story that makes it resonate so much with us today? Well, the legacy of Gilgamesh is just immense. For starters, it's the prototype for the hero's journey. But its real power, the reason it still gets to us, is because it deals with these deeply human themes that never get old. It's about friendship, it's about devastating grief, and it's about the search for meaning in the face of our own mortality. The huge lesson Gilgamesh learns is that immortality isn't about living forever. It's about the legacy you leave behind. In the end, Gilgamesh fails in his quest. He finds a magical plant that can restore youth, but a snake steals it from him. He doesn't get to live forever. But in that failure, he finds a different kind of immortality. Because here we are, 4,000 years later, still telling his story. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What is our own quest for meaning all about?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are stepping way back in time, and I mean way back, to investigate an acoustic marvel that has puzzled engineers and historians for literally centuries.
You know, for ages, there's been this incredible legend about ancient theaters like this one. The story goes that the acoustics were so perfect, you could actually hear a pin drop on stage all the way from the very last row.
So how in the world did they pull this off thousands of years before we had any kind of amplification? That's what we're digging into today. We're going to separate the facts from the legend to uncover the real secrets of their sound. All right, let's get into it.
So first up, let's talk about the legend itself. And really, the heart of this whole story is the magnificent theater at Epidaurus.
I mean, this place is so renowned that it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's constantly praised for its just unparalleled design and sound. Its reputation is, honestly, it's almost mythical.
But you know, this wasn't just about putting on a good show.
The Greeks had this deep belief that watching drama actually had positive effects on your mental and physical health. So getting that crystal clear sound was absolutely essential for what they saw as a therapeutic experience.
So what was the game plan? What were the basic design principles that even created this legend in the first place? Let's take a look at the blueprint.
The core idea was, well, it was deceptively simple but absolutely brilliant. They used geometry to capture and direct sound waves with just incredible efficiency.
They pulled this off with a few key design elements. First, you've got that steeply sloped seating area, which gives everyone clear sight and sound lines. Then there's the semicircular shape, which is often wider than 180 degrees. And finally, you have a hard, reflective orchestra floor to bounce that sound right up to the audience.
Now, the big goal here, acoustically, was something called early reflected sound. The whole design made sure that the sound bouncing off the stage and floor reached you almost instantly. Your brain actually doesn't hear it as an echo. It fuses it all together with the direct sound, which makes the actor's voice seem way louder and much, much clearer.
But okay, the geometry was only part of the story. It turns out a modern breakthrough revealed a secret that was hiding in plain sight this whole time, right in the seats themselves.
Yeah, researchers found that the material and the actual shape of the seating rows acts like a really sophisticated natural sound filter. It's this incredible feat of what you might call unintentional engineering.
So how did it work? Well, think of it this way. The corrugated rows of limestone seats basically acted like acoustic traps. They dampened all that low-frequency background noise. You know, wind, people shuffling around. But at the same time, they reflected the crucial high-frequency sounds, all those consonants like S and T that make speech understandable.
And here's where it gets really wild. Even though the seats were filtering out the low tones of an actor's voice, your brain would automatically fill them back in. It's this cool psychoacoustic trick called virtual pitch, and it means you perceive the sound as full and totally natural, even though a chunk of it is technically missing.
So, this seems like the perfect explanation, right? Mystery solved. But, like in any good story, there's a twist. Modern science decided to, well, put the actual legend to the test. A totally different team of researchers, this time from the Eindhoven University of Technology, decided to conduct a rigorous, practical experiment to see if you could really hear a pin drop.
And, well, their findings kind of poured some cold water on the whole legend. A dropped coin? You could only tell what it was about halfway up. A struck match? Almost silent. A whisper? It was gone after just a few rows. So their conclusion was that the theater's design is amazing, no doubt, but to be understood by 14,000 people, the actors needed to be loud.
And it turns out, that's where another piece of the puzzle comes in, the theatrical mask. They weren't just for showing character, they were acoustic tools. Studies show they actually amplified the voice, especially in the key frequencies of male speech, and their shape helped direct that sound out to the sides of the theater.
But the story of ancient acoustics doesn't stop with the Greeks. The Romans took this blueprint and literally built on it. And now, a whole new field of science is helping us bring these ancient sounds back to life.
Now, Roman theaters were total engineering marvels. They were often freestanding, meaning they could build them anywhere, not just on a convenient hillside. But their architectural changes, like that enormous multi-story stage wall, the Scaenae Frons, created a much more enclosed, reverberant space. The sound was just completely different from the open Greek design.
And all of this has given rise to this absolutely fascinating field called archaeoacoustics. It's where scientists study how sound actually behaved in these ancient spaces to try and understand the sensory world of the past.
For instance, researchers in Peru are using replicas of ancient conch shell horns, like these 3,000-year-old pututus, to measure echoes and sound transmission. By doing this, they can digitally recreate the entire sonic world of an ancient temple, letting us hear it just as its builders did. How cool is that?
So, after all that, what's the final verdict on the acoustic magic of the ancients? Was it just one single trick?
Well, the magic, as you've probably guessed, wasn't just one thing. It was this masterful combination. You had brilliant geometry, a happy accident with limestone physics, actors with powerful, well-trained voices, and, this is a big one, an environment that was free from all the background noise of our modern world. It really just shows a deep, intuitive understanding of how sound, space, and people all interact with each other. It's a kind of wisdom that wasn't built with computers, but with stone, earth, and an incredible ear for listening. And you know what?
That wisdom still echoes today.
You know, when we look at ancient ruins, we tend to think of them as these silent monuments to the past. But what if they're not silent at all? What if they're actually telling us a story? A story written in their fractures and flaws about our planet's most violent forces. So let's follow the clues etched in stone and see what we can uncover.
Okay, let's start with this. This is the Temple of Hephaestus in Athens, and it's one of the best preserved Greek temples in the entire world. I mean, it was built with just incredible precision over 2,000 years ago. But look a little closer at these columns. You see that? That weird kind of wavy offset in the sections? They don't line up.
So, was this just time? Simple decay over the centuries? Well, no. This isn't random. This is a very specific kind of damage. It's like a signature, a calling card, left behind by something incredibly powerful.
All right, so if we wanted to code what happened, where do we even begin? Well, it's all about reading the clues in the stones themselves. It turns out destruction has its own language, and these ancient marvels are just covered in its fingerprints.
And that strange warping we saw in Athens? It is not a one-off. Not at all. Let's jump halfway across the Mediterranean to the Colosseum in Rome. You can see something weirdly similar. Look at the arches. See how the keystones, the center stones, have dropped? It's almost like a tiny little rift opened up right in the middle. So what we're looking at, these aren't just broken buildings. They're like records, geological records of very specific, very powerful forces.
So why this specific kind of damage? Well, it's because earthquakes don't just, knock things over. They shake the ground with these violent, very specific motions. And geologists have figured out the exact fingerprints they leave behind. We're talking about blocks twisting inside a wall, columns getting offset, or even entire walls shearing sideways. That's called strike-slip deformation. These are the unique patterns that tell you this was an earthquake and not some other kind of destruction. Here's a perfect example of one of those signatures. Check out this Crusader castle in Syria. See how these massive, massive blocks in the wall have actually been rotated, twisted counterclockwise? Think about it. A cannonball can't do that. Centuries of wind and rain can't do that. It takes the crazy, violent, back-and-forth energy of an earthquake to twist solid stone like this.
You know, this whole process of reading the ruins has actually become its own fascinating field of science. It's kind of like a bridge connecting geology and history.
It's got a pretty cool name, archaeoseismology. And what is that? Well, to put it simply, it's the science of finding and studying the evidence of past earthquakes that's preserved in archaeological sites. It's basically like being a crime scene investigator for disasters that happened thousands of years ago.
So how do these detectives actually do their work? Well, their investigation really zeroes in on three main types of clues. First, they look for structures that have been literally split apart by a moving fault. Second, they dig into layers of rubble and even date ancient repairs to pinpoint exactly when a disaster happened. And third, just like we've been seeing, they meticulously study the buildings for those unique fingerprints of seismic shaking.
And today, archaeoseismologists have tools that the original archaeologists could only have dreamed of. Seriously, they don't just have to rely on what they can see on the surface anymore. Now, they can use technology to literally listen to the ground itself, all without moving a single precious stone.
For instance, they use this technique called microtremor analysis. What they do is measure the tiny, totally imperceptible vibrations that are always happening in the ground, and they can create a graph like the one you see here. This shows them the natural resonant frequency of the soil. So what does that mean? Well, think of it like finding the exact musical note that can shatter a wine glass. If an earthquake's shaking happens to match that frequency, the ground will amplify it like crazy, and the damage, well, it could be absolutely catastrophic. It's basically like predicting the future by listening to the hum of the past.
All right, so we've got a handle on how to identify these ancient quakes, but this is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Because the more scientists studied all these different sites, the more they realized something. These weren't just random acts of destruction. No, there was a much deeper connection going on.
It turns out, ancient people weren't just unlucky victims of earthquakes. In a lot of cases, they were actively drawn to these fault lines. They were building their most important cities, their most sacred sites, directly on top of what we now know is some of the most dangerous ground on the entire planet. The question is, why? Well, here's the paradox. It turns out that these active fault lines weren't just a threat, they were also a source of life. The very same geological fractures that could completely destroy a city
were also the conduits for the resources that allowed that city to grow and flourish in the first place. This fatal attraction, as researchers call it, really boils down to 4 key things. First, faults could create high cliffs, which were perfect for defense. Second, they trapped sediment, which created super fertile plains for farming. Third, and this is a big one, they acted like natural plumbing, creating reliable springs. And finally, those very same springs, which were sometimes hot or even emitted strange gases, were seen as a direct line to the divine, a gateway to the underworld.
And there's probably no better example of this than Delphi, right? The most sacred oracle in the entire ancient Greek world. Well, the whole sanctuary is built right inside a major fault zone. The sacred spring there, where priests would purify themselves, it emerges directly from a fault line. And ancient writers tell us the oracle herself would inhale these intoxicating vapors coming from a chasm in the ground, which will most likely gases like ethylene or carbon dioxide seeping up through that same fault, and that's what sent her into a prophetic trance.
The connection gets even more direct and, frankly, a little more grim at Hierapolis in modern-day Turkey. Here, the Temple of Apollo was deliberately built over a fault that was actively spewing deadly carbon dioxide. The priests would demonstrate their divine power by leading animals into this chamber. They called it the plutonium, where the poor creatures would just quickly suffocate in the invisible gas. It was a terrifying display, meant to prove the power of the underworld.
So you can really see this profound duality they were living with, right? On one hand, the fault line was a blessing. It gave them water, defense, fertile land, even a connection to their gods. But on the other hand, it was a curse, capable of unleashing absolute devastation in a single moment. It was this constant, high-stakes bargain they were making with the earth itself.
Okay, so this is all incredibly fascinating, but it's more than just a cool history lesson. Understanding this ancient relationship with the earth actually has really critical implications for us right now, today.
Here's why. Our modern, instrument-based record of earthquakes, it's shockingly short. We've only been reliably measuring them for about 150 years. I mean, that's just a blink of an eye in geological time. But by reading the ruins, archaeoseismology lets us extend that seismic history back for thousands of years. And that gives us a much clearer picture of how often and how powerfully certain faults can really let loose.
And believe me, that has very real-world consequences. Let's go back to Athens. Before the big 1999 earthquake there, risk models estimated the maximum ground acceleration, think of it as the G and G force, at 0.16. But when the quake actually hit, it registered 0.30 G. That's nearly double the shaking they thought was even possible. By going back and studying the damage to ancient structures like the Acropolis, scientists confirmed that, yep, the city had been hit by similarly strong quakes way back in its past. That's information that totally changes and dramatically improves today's hazard assessments.
This knowledge is also just vital for protecting our shared heritage. Take the Roman town of Alba Fucins in Italy. A massive earthquake back in late antiquity basically flattened the place, leaving this thick layer of destruction. When archaeologists finally uncovered it, they found all the classic signs of a huge seismic event. And today, knowing that, understanding the site's vulnerability, it directly informs how we go about conserving and reinforcing what's left, preparing it for the next inevitable quake.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, we've learned that ancient ruins aren't just static, dead monuments. They're dynamic, active archives of our planet's history. We've uncovered this incredible fatal attraction that drew ancient people to build on dangerous ground. And we've seen just how essential this ancient knowledge is for assessing our modern risks and protecting our shared cultural heritage for the future.
Really, the stones of these ancient sites, they're telling a powerful story. It's a story of creation and destruction, of reverence and risk, all at the same time. And it really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If stones could talk, what other seismic secrets about our planet are just waiting out there to be read in the ruins?
Your DNA is basically a history book. Tucked away inside every one of your cells is a story that connects you not just to your parents or your grandparents, but to every single other person on this planet. It's our shared story, and it has one of the most incredible first chapters you can imagine.
So how in the world can a few strands of genetic code tell the epic story of our species' journey across the entire globe? Well, it all kicks off with a very specific, and honestly, a very surprising pattern that we find in our DNA.
So check this out. This genetic tree tells us something absolutely fundamental. There's more genetic diversity within Africa than in the rest of the world combined. Just look at how all the non-African groups, you see them there in red, blue, and brown, are really just one small branch off the main African lineage in green. This single clue points to the most important event in our shared human story.
And to understand that clue, we have to talk about an event called the Out of Africa migration. This was a moment in time that created a massive genetic bottleneck, and it left a permanent echo in the DNA of every single person living outside of Africa today.
So what exactly is a population bottleneck? Well, think of it like this. Imagine a big bottle that's jam-packed with different colored marbles. That's our diverse population. Now, if you tip that bottle over and only a tiny handful of marbles fall out, that new group of marbles you've just created is going to have way less variety than the original bottle, right? That, in a nutshell, is exactly what happened to humanity.
Okay, let's put this on a timeline to really get it. Our species, Homo sapiens, shows up in Africa around 300,000 years ago. And for hundreds of thousands of years, that was our home base. That's where we lived, and that's where we diversified. But then, sometime between 50 and 100,000 years ago, one small group made the incredible journey out of the continent, and their descendants would eventually populate all of Asia, Europe, the Americas, and Oceania.
And this isn't just some ancient history factoid. It means that if your family tree has roots outside of Africa, you are a direct descendant of this one single pioneering group. So just how small was that group?
Get ready for this. Genetic analyses estimate that the effective population size, we're talking the number of breeding individuals that successfully founded the entire non-African world, was as low as 1,300 people. That's it. A group the size of a small village gave rise to billions of us. This tiny number is the reason for the bottleneck, and as you can imagine, it had some pretty dramatic genetic consequences. So, researchers at the University of New Mexico decided to analyze this genetic echo by looking at our DNA like a story of addition and subtraction. What was lost when that small group left Africa, and what was gained in the thousands of years that followed. To track all of this, they used something called group-specific polymorphisms, or GSPs. The easiest way to think about these are like genetic markers, or maybe fingerprints. They're basically gene variants that are common in Africa but super rare everywhere else, or the other way around. These GSPs are the fingerprints left behind by that bottleneck event. Okay, and here's the crucial point. The genetic variants that are common only in Africa represent what was lost by the migrating group. They were literally left behind in the bottle, so to speak. And the variants that you find only outside of Africa, well, that's what was gained. These were new mutations that popped up as that small group spread across the entire globe. And the data, even from just a single chromosome, is pretty staggering. Scientists found over 6,300 unique genetic markers in African populations that were lost by the migrants. Now, compare that to what was gained in non-African populations, only about 1,800. That's a more than 3-to-1 ratio of genetic subtraction versus addition. It's a huge difference.
This chart just visualizes that imbalance perfectly. The large downward red spikes, that's all the genetic diversity that was lost. The smaller upward blue spikes show what was gained. You really don't need to be a geneticist to see the story here. The losses are massive and they are frequent, while the gains are small and pretty sparse.
And these histograms make the contrast even more obvious. On the left, you see a lot of big clusters of lost genetic material. On the right, the gained clusters are just, well, they're much smaller and way less frequent. The bottleneck was defined far more by what was left behind than by what was newly created.
So why, right? Why this dramatic imbalance between loss and gain? The answer lies in two fundamental forces of evolution that just happen to operate on very, very different speeds.
So, the massive losses were primarily caused by something called genetic drift. I mean, in a tiny population of just 1,300 people, it's really easy for common gene variants to be lost by pure chance in just one generation. It's a fast and random process. The gains, on the other hand, are mostly driven by natural selection. A new mutation that helps people survive in a colder climate, for example, takes thousands of years to slowly become common. It's a much, much slower process.
The researchers used a great analogy with wolves to explain this. Up on top, that's the genetic profile of a stable wolf population. You can see it's got low but even variation. But on the bottom, those are wolves that went through a severe bottleneck. And the result is this jagged sawtooth pattern, showing where large chunks of diversity were just randomly lost.
That jagged pattern is the classic signature of a population bottleneck. It shows exactly where big chunks of genetic diversity just vanished. And this is precisely the kind of pattern scientists see when they look at the genomes of non-African humans. Genetically speaking, you could almost say we're the Isle Royale wolves of the primate world.
Okay, so let's step back for a second and think about what this incredible story really means for us today. This shared journey, this one bottleneck event, has some really profound implications for how we understand human diversity.
See, because non-Africans all descend from that same small group, the genetic differences between continents are surprisingly small. In fact, about 90% of all human genetic variation exists within populations. Only a tiny 10% is what separates one group from another.
And the total amount of variation is tiny to begin with. Any two people on Earth, it doesn't matter where they're from, are 99.9% genetically identical. The differences that we see are coded for by just a minuscule fraction of our DNA.
And this leads us to the most important takeaway of all. In the words of the geneticists who study this stuff, our DNA simply does not support the idea of distinct biological races. Our shared history is just too recent, and our shared ancestry is way too narrow.
So we end right where we began. Our history is indeed written in our DNA. And it turns out it's not a story of division, but one of a single small group of pioneers whose journey out of Africa made all of us who we are today. It's a story of shared origins, a shared bottleneck, and a profoundly shared humanity.
Have you ever really stopped to look at the stuff around you? I mean, really look. The color of the shirt you're wearing, the food you eat for dinner. These aren't just things. Turns out they're packed with thousands of years of history, identity, and meaning. So let's dive in and see how the materials we use are actually telling the story of who we are.
Okay, it all starts with this incredible mystery, one that goes way, way back to the very dawn of humanity. For tens of thousands of years, across different continents and cultures, our ancestors were, well, they were obsessed with one color in particular for their most sacred rituals: red. Specifically, this pigment called red ochre. The question is, why? Why that color?
And just to get your head around the timescale here, we're talking about 100,000 years. For that long, our ancestors would coat their dead in this bright red powder. This wasn't some passing trend, it was one of the most long-lasting spiritual traditions in all of human history. So what on earth do they see in this red dust?
Well, the answer is just incredibly profound. You see, for these ancient people, red ochre wasn't just some color. It was a physical connection to the life force of the planet. It was blood, it was the cycle of life, death, and the promise of rebirth. It was like they were wrapping their loved ones in the very essence of life itself.
And this is the key to our whole explainer today. This choice, this obsession with red ochre, it wasn't random at all. It was the very beginning of a deep, fundamental human instinct to find meaning, to find our own stories in the raw stuff of the earth.
Now, this pattern didn't stop with red dust. Not even close. Let's take a look at how this same idea played out in other huge civilizations, where different colors were used to represent, well, everything, from the sacredness of life to the skin of the gods themselves.
Take ancient Egypt. For them, the color green was everything. It was the color of new life, of all the vegetation that burst forth from the Nile. But here's the twist. It was also the color of death. So, wait a second. How can one single color mean two totally opposite things?
The answer to that puzzle lies with this guy, Osiris. He was the god who ruled the afterlife, and he was almost always shown with green skin. But that green wasn't a sign of decay. No, it was a symbol of resurrection, the absolute promise that new life would spring from death just like the crops grew from the earth every single year. That one color captured the entire cosmic cycle.
Now let's jump thousands of miles away, to the American plains. The Pawnee Nation had a deep, deep reverence for the color red. For them, it was the color of the sun, the ultimate source of all life, but it was also the color of the sacred land itself. So when they painted red pigment onto ceremonial objects, like on the inside of this very bowl, it was a way of literally infusing that object with divine power.
So you see the same amazing pattern in two totally different cultures, right? They both found these profound, dual meanings in a single color. For the Egyptians, green was the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. For the Pawnee, red connected the sky above with the earth below.
It just goes to show how we use materials to make sense of the world's biggest mysteries.
But our relationship with all this stuff goes even deeper than the surface. It's not just about what we put on our bodies, it's about what we put in them. Let's dig into how the food we eat literally becomes a building block of who we are.
You know that old saying, you are what you eat? Well, for the ancient Maya, that wasn't just some catchy phrase. It was their literal truth. Their most sacred creation myth tells how the gods tried making humans out of mud, then out of wood, but they kept failing. They only finally got it right when they used corn dough. Humanity's very substance was their staple crop. And because of that, corn was never just food. It was divine. The corn god was one of the most important figures in their entire universe. And he wasn't just the god of corn. He was the divine spirit of the very plant that gave birth to their people. Think about that. Their whole world, their myths, their rituals, their calendar, their relationship with the gods, it all revolved around the cycle of planting and harvesting corn. Everything was tied back to this one sacred plant.
Okay, now let's hop halfway across the world to Japan. Here, a totally different grain, rice, became just as vital in defining an entire culture's identity. In Japanese mythology, the sun goddess herself gave the first rice grains to her grandson to plant on the islands, literally transforming it into a land of earthly abundance.
Now, to really get the power of rice in Japan, we need this one word, commensality. It sounds a little academic, but it's a simple idea. It's the act of eating together, and its effect is incredibly powerful. Sharing food, especially a staple food like rice, forges these incredibly strong social bonds.
And you can see this perfectly in the common Japanese expression, taberu zinsen ni kage ni taberu jisaku, to eat from the same rice cooking pan. That doesn't just mean you had lunch together. It means you're part of the same tribe, the same family, the same company. It means you belong together.
This idea became so ingrained that rice was actually used to define who was us and who was them. A powerful, symbolic divide grew between domestic rice, which was seen as pure and essentially Japanese, and foreign rice, which was often talked about as an impurity, something that could even contaminate their identity. The grain itself became a kind of border.
Now, these stories about materials, they aren't just stuck in ancient history. They are living, breathing legacies that are being reclaimed and even rewritten today. And sometimes that whole story is packed into a single leaf. Let's take the story of indigo dye. For centuries, it was this revered part of a rich cultural tradition in West Africa. But then, in the 1700s, its story takes a very dark turn. It becomes a massive cash crop on plantations in the Americas, and its production was fueled by the knowledge and the stolen labor of enslaved Africans. Later, synthetic dyes nearly wiped it out completely. But now, today, a powerful revival is happening as artists and communities are using the plant to reconnect with that heritage and reclaim that history.
This quote from artist Stephen Hamilton just captures it perfectly. For him, and for so many others, working with indigo isn't just about making art. It's an act of reclaiming history. It's about honoring the labor of his ancestors and reconnecting with knowledge that was stolen. The material itself becomes a way to heal, a way to forge an identity.
So what this all really shows us is that from that ancient red dust of our ancestors, to the corn that gave birth to a civilization, to the indigo threads that connect us to a really complex past, the materials we use are never just neutral. They're like archives. They hold the stories of where we came from, what we believe, our struggles, and even our hopes for who we want to become.
And all of this leaves us with one final big question. A question for you, really. Just look around at the food on your plate, the clothes on your back, the things you cherish. What are their stories? And what materials are telling the story of you?
Let's just think about this for a second. For thousands of years, people were crossing these enormous empty oceans, connecting the entire world long before we had satellites or GPS. So how did they do it? They did it with skill, sure, and a ton of courage, but also with these amazing tools that let them read the sky like a map. So how on earth did they turn the stars into directions?
You know, the poet John Masefield just nails it with this line. There's something so romantic about it, right? This idea of pure adventure, being guided by the only things you can truly rely on out there, the stars and the sun. It really speaks to that human need to just go, to explore the unknown.
But, okay, let's get real for a minute. Imagine you're out there, in the middle of the ocean, water in every direction, and it all looks exactly the same. One little mistake, one bad calculation, and you are lost, potentially forever. This was the terrifying life-or-death puzzle that every single ancient sailor had to solve every single day. So, faced with this incredible challenge, where did they even start? Well, before they had any fancy instruments, they had to learn to read the world around them, to speak the language of the ocean itself. I mean, at first, the solution was pretty simple. Don't lose sight of the coast, right? But the true masters, people like the Polynesian navigators, they developed this incredible art form called wayfinding. This was way beyond just looking. They essentially became living compasses. They could feel the subtle changes in ocean swells bouncing off islands hundreds of miles away. They knew the exact flight paths of birds migrating to land. It's this deep, intuitive knowledge of the natural world that, honestly, is kind of hard for us to even wrap our heads around today.
But to really cross the open ocean, intuition isn't enough. You need hard data. And the first big technical problem to solve was figuring out your latitude, basically how far north or south you are on the globe. And to do that, sailors had to look up, from the waves to the stars.
And this is where we see human ingenuity just explode. It's here that we start to see these amazing specialized tools, each one a massive leap forward in the mission to map the unknown.
And look, this wasn't some overnight success story. It was this slow burn of innovation that took thousands of years. You've got the Phoenicians with their early charts, the ancient Mesopotamians figuring out the basic geometry of the stars, all leading up to the astrolabe in the Greek world. This was a truly global effort, with knowledge being passed down and built upon for centuries.
Now, of all these incredible early tools, there is one that really stands out. It's a true masterpiece of engineering. People often call it the ancient world smartphone, or its Swiss Army knife, the astrolabe.
The name itself pretty much tells you the whole story. Astrolabes comes from the Greek astrolabos, which literally means star taker, and that's exactly what it did. It was like a physical model of the universe that you could hold in your hand, allowing you to take a star and measure its position precisely. But just calling it a star taker, that's a massive understatement. Get this. A 10th century astronomer, Al-Sufi, described over 1,000 different uses for this one device. 1,000. I mean, that's not just versatile, that is absolutely mind-blowing. And just look at the range of things it could do. Yeah, of course, it was for navigation, but it was also a clock, a calendar, a tool for surveying land, and it played a huge role in religion, like finding the exact times for daily prayers in Islam, or pointing the way to Mecca. It was a scientific, cultural, and spiritual computer all rolled into one. So how did this beautiful, complicated thing actually work? Well, the simplest way to think about it is like a series of stacked, rotating disks. You've got one disk that's a map of the stars, another one that's engraved just for your specific latitude on Earth. By lining them up and using a little sighting roll on the back, you could basically create a model of the entire sky for any time, any day, and get a precise angle of a star above the horizon.
The astrolabe was a work of art, no question. But it was also really complex and expensive to make. So for the rough and tumble life out on the high seas, a lot of sailors needed something simpler, something more rugged.
And that's where the crossstaff comes in. Its design was actually inspired by an even simpler Arab tool called the kamal. The crossstaff wasn't trying to do 1,000 things. It was built for one job and one job only, quickly measuring the angle between the horizon and a star to figure out your latitude.
And its design was brutally simple. I mean, look at it. It's just a long stick with another stick across it that slides back and forth. That's it. The genius was all in how you used it. And using it was just as straightforward. The navigator would hold the end of the staff up to his eye, and then he'd slide that crosspiece until the bottom just touched the horizon and the top lined up perfectly with a star. And boom, the scale right on the staff gave him the angle. Simple, fast, effective. So when you put these two side by side, you really see the trade-offs. The astrolabe was the complex, do-everything super tool. The crossstaff was simple, cheap, and all about navigation. But, and this is a big but, the crossstaff had a major flaw. To use it during the day, you had to stare directly at the sun, which, as you can probably guess, was a terrible idea that could literally blind you. Now, both of these amazing instruments, the astrolabe and the crossstaff, they cracked the code for latitude. But neither one of them could even touch the single biggest, most difficult problem in the entire history of navigation. See, here's the thing. Latitude, north-south, that's a question of space. You measure your position against fixed points in the sky. But longitude, your east-west position,
That's a question of time. Because the Earth is spinning, to know how far east or west you are, you have to know the exact time right where you are and, at the exact same moment, know the time at a fixed point back home. And doing that on a rocking ship in the middle of the ocean was, for centuries, completely impossible.
So here's the bottom line. These tools were brilliant, but they had very real limits. They were really hard to use on a swaying deck, they could be dangerous, and while they solved for latitude, longitude was left to something called dead reckoning, which is basically just educated guesswork. You guess your speed, you guess your direction, and you hope for the best. The one thing they needed, the key to the whole puzzle, was a clock that could keep perfect time at sea, and they just didn't have it.
But let's not sell these tools short. Even with those limitations, the astrolabe and the cross staff were complete game changers. They were good enough to give sailors the confidence to finally leave the coastlines behind and venture out into the unknown. They enabled the great voyages of the Age of Discovery and completely redrew our map of the world. And all of this kind of leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Today, we have perfect navigation right in our pockets, but in gaining that incredible power, that certainty, what have we lost? What ancient arts of seeing, of reading the stars and the waves, that deep human connection to the world around us, have we maybe forgotten?
So picture this. You're running late. You pull out your phone, you pop in an address, and boom, there's the map. There's the little blue dot that says you are here, the red pin showing you where you're going, and that perfect blue line telling you exactly how to get there. It's simple. It's a fact. It's the truth, right? And we just trust it. We trust that little screen to guide us, no questions asked. And you know, that trust is nothing new. For centuries, we've been taught to see maps as these totally objective, scientific things. They're all about precision and mathematics, just a reflection of the world as it is. They're not supposed to be opinions, they're mirrors. Or at least, that's what we've been told.
The writer and aviator Beryl Markham just nailed this feeling. A map speaks with this incredible authority. It says, "Doubt me not." And that feeling, that sense of absolute, unquestionable certainty, well, that is exactly what makes a map one of the most powerful tools of persuasion on Earth.
But what happens when that trust gets complicated? What happens when that supposedly simple, factual document becomes the very heart of a conflict? When a single line drawn on a piece of paper becomes a line in the sand, something to be defended with warships and political firestorms? I mean, really think about that for a second. If maps were just simple pictures of reality, what would there be to even argue about? The truth is, maps aren't just describing conflicts. A lot of the time, they're the very thing that starts them. They become Exhibit A in these huge geopolitical arguments that can drag on for hundreds of years. And this is not some new phenomenon. We're talking centuries of this stuff. I mean, there was literally a line war between New York and New Jersey way back in the 1700s. Or a dispute between Argentina and Chile over a map that went on for almost a century. Arguing about lines on a map isn't just some fringe activity, it's a core part of how countries have defined who they are. Okay, so let's fast forward to today. The South China Sea is a perfect and pretty tense modern example. In this case, the map itself, specifically China's 9-dash line, is the battlefield. It's the reason for naval standoffs, for international rulings being flat out rejected, for violent confrontations. This is all happening because of a claim made on a map. It's proof that maps do way more than just show us where we are. So to really get what's going on, we need a totally new way to look at maps. We have to stop seeing them as just pretty pictures and start reading them like they're complex texts. You know, full of hidden agendas and silent assumptions. We need to learn how to deconstruct the map. This whole idea was really championed by a brilliant geographer named J.B. Harley, and he argued that we have to pay just as much attention to what a map doesn't show as what it does. What places are left unnamed, which borders are drawn with thick, bold lines, and which are faded. It's in these choices, these silences, that you can find the political and social agendas that actually built the map. Harley's point was that for too long, we've been obsessed with the science of map making. You know, the surveying, the geometry, all the technical stuff. And in the process, we've completely ignored the power structures working behind the curtain. We just accept the mapmaker's claim of being objective, when we should really be asking, who paid for this map and why? And this all leads us to the single most important idea in this whole explainer. Maps are not mirrors of reality. They are arguments. Every single map is arguing for a particular version of the world. It might be a political claim, a social hierarchy, a national identity. A map is never passive. It's an active, persuasive piece of communication. And once you start to see maps as arguments, you suddenly realize how they've been used throughout history as these incredibly powerful weapons. Not just weapons of war, but weapons of power. They're not just for navigating, they're for dominating, for legitimizing rule, and for spreading propaganda. Hartley actually broke this down into two types of power. First, there's external power. This is the obvious stuff, right? A government wants to claim territory, so they draw a map with new borders. They want to plan an invasion, they make a map. It's the map as a tool of the state. But then there's internal power, and this is the really subtle, powerful stuff. This is the power hidden in the map's design, the symbols, the colors, the way things are labeled. This is where the map's argument hides in plain sight, disguised as scientific fact. Okay, check this out. This is external power in action. We're looking at two maps of North America from the exact same year, 1754. On the left, you've got the British map, making a clear argument. All this land, stretching way into the continent, is ours. But on the right, the French map is making the exact opposite argument about a lot of the same territory. These weren't just maps, they were declarations of intent. They were visual arguments for building an empire. Now let's talk about internal power, because this is where things can get even more insidious. This table here comes from something called a moral and political chart that was used in American schools in 1831. The map that went with it literally colored the world based on these rankings. It wasn't just showing kids geography, it was teaching them a specific worldview. It was arguing that Christian, Republican societies were enlightened while labeling huge parts of the planet as savage and pagan. It's an argument for cultural superiority baked right into the map's legend. And sometimes the argument isn't even trying to be subtle. I mean, look at this. This 1886 map is pure propaganda, designed to make the British Empire look glorious. You've got this heroic figure of Britannia literally sitting on top of the world with colonial subjects looking up at her. The map isn't just showing you how big the empire is. It's arguing for its goodness, its strength, and its God-given right to rule. So the takeaway here is actually pretty profound. Maps don't just show us the world that exists. They help build the world we live in. By drawing a line on a piece of paper, you can literally create a nation where one didn't exist before. By choosing a color, you can justify an invasion. By picking a label, you can reinforce a prejudice. Maps are active agents in creating our reality. Okay, so this isn't just a history lesson about old, dusty atlases. How does all of this apply to the maps that we use every single day? Because this is absolutely about the world you see on your screen right now. Let's just take Wikipedia's page for the list of territorial disputes. You'd think a simple list would be objective, right? But if you look at the discussion page behind it, it is a modern-day cartographic battlefield. You have editors arguing back and forth, throwing around accusations of nationalism, debating what full control even means, fighting over the status of places like Kashmir. Every single entry on that list is a contested argument, proving that these map wars are still being fought every day, right now, in the digital world. And this brings it all back around to that final, brilliant point from J.B. Harley. Power isn't just in what the map shows. Power is woven into the entire process of how a map gets made. Who gets to decide what data is included, what the symbols look like, and most importantly, who gets to draw the lines in the first place. And that is why all of this matters to you. When you see an election map on the news, the choice of colors, the way districts are drawn, it can completely change how you feel about the results. When Google Maps shows a border as a dotted line, it's making a very careful, very political statement about a disputed territory. Every map you look at is trying to convince you of something. So the next time you glance at a map, on your phone, on a news site, anywhere, I want you to just pause for a second. Remind yourself, this is not just a picture. This is an argument. And then ask yourself, what is this map trying to convince me of? What did its creator choose to show me? And more importantly, what did they choose to leave out?